One that's the Terry Holmes.
It's fine for you just sign it. I'm just wondering if the bottom says have John's name on it.
I know the minutes do, I'm not sure.
Says chairman's signature.
So then should we just hold off on minutes if they get approved next
I
time?
think it's fine, there's something you should know.
Okay.
Maybe just like.
Yeah, this one does say John. Yeah. Say,
So it's Drew, it's just Drew here and
John may approve.
Oh, wait.
One.
which one sounds good.
Drew's on it, Chris, yeah.
Don't run in the warm room, so bad.
Hello.
Still done. Hello. Like that kid in that Christmas movie. Like that little kid in Christmas, in that older Christmas movie where he's like this.
Yeah.
Mom got walking around like this.
I haven't smoked in probably.
Thought I was okay, but then I had the park so far away, I didn't want to get freaks. I saw that you were on the wrestling area, and when there's nothing there, maybe even then.
Middle school basketball every day.
Middle school, high school's good.
And require this guys. Music.
That's it, and then volleyball's, women's volleyball's getting ready to start.
Well, in Europe, it is that. Noticing that. Yeah.
But you know, we can put that on the website.
You can.
December.
I don't know either.
It's probably going to science. Okay. Just get it on,
Start it, get it
go to
going.
your thing. And then update the application.
Okay.
If it even. And check the terms on.
Evening, Rusty.
Good evening.
No resting.
Hi.
Drew is on a cruise and John is traveling for work, last minute trip to LA. Yeah, down and back, he went down on Sunday, might be back tonight or early tomorrow morning.
It's not ready for that.
You may try joining us online. Guys are stuck with the chair. try to stumble through it best I can. All right, 6:00 p.m. We'll go ahead and order the board meeting, Pleasant Hill School District, December 5th, 2022. We'll go ahead and start with pledge of allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. I'll go ahead and read the mission statement. Our mission is to graduate all students with high levels of academic and personal achievement, ready for post-secondary excellence, and prepared for productive and passionate citizenship through research-based instruction and collaborative system of support. 2.0 changes or additions to the agenda. I think we're, as Jim pointed out right before we got started, there's the, oh yeah, 5.2 superintendent contract. We're gonna have to push that back to a subsequent meeting. Any other additions or deletions to the agenda? 3.0 introductions to current board meeting and attendance of previous board meeting. Doesn't look like we have anybody in person tonight. And what about at our last board meeting?
Last board meeting, there was 1 online and 5 on site.
Thank you. 4.0 public forum. I bet John wasn't misreading this. For individuals who are on site during this portion of the board meeting, members of the public are specifically invited to present items of commendation and/or concerns. At the discretion of the board chair, further public participation may be allowed at the time specific agenda items are under consideration by the board. Under district policy BDDH. Individuals who are viewing online, PHSD posts the upcoming agenda on our website, pleasanthill.k12.or.us, the Friday before regularly scheduled Monday school board meetings. This will allow for public comment prior to the board meeting. Please click on the tab provided to share your comments for the school board to consider at the upcoming meeting. Please note, personnel matters may not be discussed in public at a school board meeting. Members of the public who have personnel concerns or accommodations should share them directly with the district superintendent. 5.0 board action items. 5.1 consent agenda. Any issues with board meeting minutes from November 14th? And none either. 5.102 financial reports. Anything there we need to be aware of?
No, I don't, but I think maybe it's such a meeting to share your knowledge to that.
Right, something to keep in mind for planning on our next work session, potentially, or
January would be a quarter.
More detail.
Rusty, any
Information. Okay.
Rusty, any questions or concerns from there, or anything that we should draw our attention to, Sherry? Okay. So 5.103, hiring of Terry Holmes, temporary 9th grade seminar, 6th grade PE credit recovery. But Will and I noted that in the document that's provided here in our packet that the interview panel consisted of 1 person, and I know that we're dealing with a whole new admin team, both the district level and at the secondary level, so Is this just the way it worked out for this particular hiring, do we know, or?
Yeah, so the temporary position, we were looking to get somebody in fairly quickly. I believe this was the point as well. And somebody has been cited for us.
Oh, okay,
Issue is setting for this position.
got it.
Sure.
I have nothing in the candidate, she's kind of great, but our practice was that somebody from the community on that.
Well, maybe discuss the between permanent and temporary as well. So what's happening is we've got two positions that are contract filled. So they're just looking at staffing out there. Yeah, there's no. Qualified candidates for positions.
Anything on that? Okay. 5.104 OSAA collective sponsorship application. Be able to get a little background on this?
Yeah, so there's generally two options, as one of the two, and basically what it does in this particular case is we've got a student that's homeschooled that lives in Pleasant community that is its their club coach is actually the head coach of Churchill High School, you know, offer swimming. This provides a collective sponsorship where she can certainly live in her name, but for Churchill.
Is this the same student we had previously?
Yeah.
So I remember this coming up before, we had, obviously we approved. Forgive me, is this something we can do in one motion, or do we have to hear separate motions for each?
Yeah, it's all. I'll move to the consent agenda as presented.
All right, any further discussion? All those in favor say aye. Aye. Passes unanimously. All right, 6.0 board communication. 7.0 other business. Anything else? Go to the order. 8.0 next meetings. After this, we're on winter break. Our next board meeting will be January 9th at 7 p.m. or the subsequent will be February 13th at 7 p.m. All right. 9.0 will adjourn the board meeting portion and go into work session. I'll put it over to Steve Kelly from OSBA.
Thank you very much. And good evening, and thanks for being here. I know you guys are super busy. I appreciate you, the work that you do. For those that don't know, I'm Steve Kelly. I'm Director of Board Development at the Oregon School Board Association. This is my 8th year with OSBA. In a previous life, I was a superintendent in South Umpqua, assistant superintendent in Lebanon, and lots of other jobs in my 40 years of education. Tonight, our agenda, which I think is there's a separate agenda at your place. Is that right? There's one for the board meeting, one for the work session. And so you kind of see a different outline of tonight. My hope is that your questions in the conversation will really drive the work session. I've got some presentation, but I don't really want this to be presentational. I really want it to be based on your needs, your questions, as we work through this evening. And so in general, the topics were kind of roles and responsibilities, kind of broad strokes there. Communication protocols, or talking about communication, was a big topic that was given to me. The board superintendent operating agreements. I think there's an example in your packet, plus I also found one on your website. And so I brought copies of it tonight as well. So I don't know if that's the current one, or if you want to move away from that one, but we'll get into that. I think it's best to talk about roles and responsibilities, communication protocols first, then we'll move right into that. And then there's a very specific request for advisory committees, board advisory committees versus superintendent advisory committees. And we'll kind of take that wherever it fits. It might fit under roles and responsibilities, but we'll definitely won't leave this evening without having that conversation. And then last but not least, depending on our time, I'd like to start a conversation around the board's role and impact in student achievement, which I believe is the reason that everybody's in the room, right? But the other things were requested first, so we'll go through them.
What was in it for the purse?
You were in it for the perks, for the pay, right? For the pay.
Still waiting.
But there could be perks.
5 years in, I'm still waiting.
There you go. So please someone remind me of our end time, because we've got lots to talk about tonight. I'm sure we'll run right up to whatever that end time expectation is. So let's just remind me what time is you want to be done by.
Specific here.
We're here to learn.
Okay, all right. Well, I'll let you tell me when you've had enough. I mean, obviously we won't go till midnight, right? But we'll be here as long as you're getting something out. All right. And, so
At 8 o'clock would be a good target, I guess.
okay, so we'll shoot for 8, we'll check in at 8, because that gives us almost 2 full hours of good conversation. Great. All right, so I think I'm gonna skip kind of the formal introductions, if that's okay. I know most of the people in the room have worked together before. I do want you to remind me how long you've been in your current role. And Jim, I know that this is your first year, or we could put yours in weeks, maybe months. Okay, weeks, so you're probably the newest person in the room, all right, your first superintendent role?
Yeah.
Okay, and a little bit more about your background.
So spent almost my entire career at Springfield as a teacher and shoot, I guess the last 15, 16, 17, 19 years as administrator, culminated with being assistant director of resources for the last 3 years.
Great, thank you very much. So just down the road, right, Springfield, you're very familiar with the area. Will remind us how long you've been on the board. Now, we can put yours in decades. I started to say that, I thought, oh, Steve, don't say that, but very proud of your service. You can serve for how long?
The board, 2006.
I'm sorry,
2006.
2006.
I taught in the district since 84.
Okay, so 16, 17 years. So when we talk about roles and responsibilities, we're going to ask for your guidance, because you've seen a lot,
I think,
right? Now, I know John's been on the board a number of years.
same as I have.
Okay, so I thought you guys kind of came together the last time we talked. Steve, I think you just said 5 years.
This is my 6th.
Okay, starting your 6th year. And Rusty, I remember you were one of my new second year. Good, and Drew was relatively new too, so his second year. So I thought we had kind of both ends of the continuum, right? And then Steve was kind of in the middle, and Kimberly?
Yes, I've been here since August.
Since August, all right, so. Newcomers. Middle. In the continuum, pretty new, all right, good. We'll have a good conversation then. So I just want to kind of set the stage from the background a little bit before we kind of get into your questions and broad stroke kind of the roles and responsibilities. But most, if not all, what we're going to talk about tonight is based and rooted in research. In the late 90s, there was little or no research on the effectiveness of school boards. So the Lighthouse projects came along in the late 90s, early 2000s, and kind of broke that trend. In 2008, OSBA brought what they call the Lighthouse Project to Oregon at that time. And that was the first year that I was a superintendent in South Oklahoma. So we were one of the first 3 school districts in the state of Oregon to get the full, and at that time, full Lighthouse Project training. 72 hours over 2 years, 3 hours every month for 24 months. Is the initial training. It was a lot. It was too much. I will tell you that. We changed that training over time, but when it first was introduced, again, we were just getting our feet wet on what was effective board work. What does the research say? So forth and so on. So the Lighthouse studies were some of the first. There's a couple of other gentlemen here. Allsbury, I'm going to quote a lot of his stuff tonight, that he and Bill Gore wrote a very good manual, if you will, on improving school board effectiveness. And what Tom calls his balanced governance approach, which I'm going to refer to in just a moment, we at OSBA call ours a collaborative governance approach. They're very similar. Tom came in and worked with the team a little over a year and a half ago during COVID, and we've adopted a lot, if not many, of his principles. And like I said, he calls his balanced governance. And one of the things I like, and I pull out of Tom's stuff, is this piece. Because there's a continuum of governance in terms of the actions of the school board. Now, we hear many times about the micromanaging board. You know, the board that gets too involved in the operations and the details and how detrimental that is. Those are the boards that sometimes, many times, make the headlines. But one of the things we learned from Tom is that being disengaged, or what we would call a rubber stamp board, too hands off, is just as detrimental as a micromanaging board. And Tom's fascinating. I'm not going to go into all the details. I'm probably the only research geek here in the bunch. But he has case study after case study about rubber stamp boards or disengaged boards. So he calls it balanced governance because his sweet spot, our sweet spot, is in the middle, what we call an informed oversight. And this is where roles and responsibilities becomes very important. What's the role of the board? What's the role of the superintendent? Because it's not always black and white, as we're going to talk about in just a moment. All right. So as I refer to, we call it collaborative governance. I personally like the collaborative. To me, it's a bit more action oriented. It promotes a partnership between the superintendent and the board. So, and I know this is not the most convenient, and I won't have you staring up there all night long, but I do want you to look at that definition. A few years ago, the board development team and I wrote a what you would call a position paper on the research, which again is available if you want it. I'm happy to send it to you. But we boiled it down to this definition, so we can take this around and talk about kind of the essence of what we're at. And if I had to boil down 72 hours of lighthouse training, I could probably do it in those 30 words or less. So I'd like you to look at that definition for a moment. And I want you to pull out a word or a phrase that you think exemplifies the strength of this board, of this school district, of this relationship between board and superintendent. What, when you read through that definition, resonates? Yeah, that's a strength. We can hang our hat on that. That doesn't mean it's perfect, but it's a strength. I'm going to give you a moment, and now I'm going to ask everybody, and Kimberly, I mean everybody, to respond. Stephen, because you're the acting board chair, you can go first.
I'd say collective responsibility.
And what makes you say that?
I think as a board, we're constantly looking to improve. We'll find ways that we can actually affect student outcomes. And that's been my experience the 5+ years I've been doing this. We're constantly seeking better ways to evaluate ourselves, seeking better ways of going about measuring student achievement. Like you said, it's not exactly perfect, but we're constantly seeking to improve. We're constantly holding ourselves as a board accountable to that goal, and constantly asking for trainings. And I think it's something that we prioritize in our hiring search as well.
Let me brag on you for a moment. You, the board. I love the fact that I've been here so many times and you have yet to fail to read your mission statement at board meeting. Like it's number one, this is most important, we're gonna start with this. You might be one of the only. I might be able to think of one other maybe, but it always has struck me that our mission is. So thank you very much. I think that's very, very important. We'll just keep working our way around here. Well, you go next. What resonates with you?
I like the phrase learn and lead together. Alliteration, but I think, as Steve said, we keep trying to learn, and then we try to apply what we learn to our leadership. Again, it's not perfect. Lots of different ways to do that. Learning lots of different areas and we find that.
You know, I should have wrote that down, and put it in an envelope before we started, because I would have picked that phrase for you. Knowing you as well as I do. I was not surprised when you picked that. So thank you very much. Jim, what about you? When you read that, I know you've only been here weeks, but I'm sure you have some sense of how things work here. What stands out to you?
I'm on the collective responsibility as well. Just to show that working with the board. And it's that collective sense of responsibility for. Particularly like the fact that the board leads with the mission statements. Each time I do that, anytime I'm working with staff or public areas to go back to where our mission statements, just that sense of where we got all the air we got here in this extra.
Thank you very much. I gave you actually my last handout first because it has the collective governance definition on it. So that's the piece of paper that I handed out. We may or may not get to what's beneath it, but you'll at least have this definition. And if we don't get to the board's role in student achievement tonight, maybe I will pique your interest enough to read through that and we will continue the conversation at another time. Again, that's assuming we don't get there. Kimberly, what do you think?
I like high expectations and outcomes for all students. As long as important.
Nice, thank you very much. Rusty.
Trust and respect, no doubt. And I think that's probably as the new guy. Learning who each of these folks are and how that as the new guy as well. Learning about each other. Trying to figure each other out a little bit and appreciate the perspectives. And the wealth of experience and knowledge that I have. And how much that matters and trying to figure out how to be a great school board. I also jumped on the high expectations now. I mean, for me, that's just district is all about. It has been since my kids were here 20 years ago. So that's sort of a no-brainer. But with respect to the board, trust and respect, probably the first two words that popped out.
Great, thank you very much.
That would be my second choice.
Pardon me?
That would be my second choice.
So let me really put you on the spot. Normally I would stop there, move on and continue with our program, but I'm going to take a chance here. Looking at that definition, what would you like to improve? Doesn't mean it's bad, it doesn't mean it doesn't exist, but when you look at that, is there a piece there that you feel like if we focused on that, if we really improved on this, we can really move the dial? And again, it could be something you've already mentioned, but you would just think this is the focal point. This is where I'd really like to see us improve. Take a minute, think about that. I don't mean it as a negative, I just think it's high level of importance. We can really do some work here. And while you're thinking about that, I should define one piece of this, what I mean by effective partnerships. Okay. Because for a board, I think there's three levels of partnerships. One is board of superintendent. I've alluded to that one already. Second partnership that this definition speaks to is among board members. How you work together. So that's separate from board as a whole working with superintendent. And the third partnership is board and community. So that's what we mean by effective partnerships, utilizing effective partnerships. So other than that, I think unless there's something else out there that you'd like for me to define a little further. I think that's when I read through that, you may not know what I mean by effective partnerships. All right, Stephen, I'm going to start with you again. What's an area that you would like to see improvement or focus or?
Well, I think that's why I left, because effective partnerships, that was the third thing that you mentioned, the board and the community. And we discussed that multiple times since I've been here, to try to figure out ways to brainstorm how we can involve the community more. I mean, we do to some level. We've got Jack. I myself at times have been involved with the foundation, but I still would like to, and I think the rest of the board would agree to have more engagement with the community on a regular basis.
Okay, Wilda?
When I was little, we were like 8 or 7 or 8. I was making memorize a lot of stuff. And one thing I memorized was good, better, best, never let it rest, till your good is better and your better best. So, other things, all of those things, I think, could be improved. And would be where the attitude one.
That's the task.
Task. I would choose outcomes and all students. I think we still have some achievement gap. Working at closing, but they're still good.
Okay, thank you for that. So I'm hearing board partnership with community, looking at your achievement gaps and outcomes, high expectations, outcomes for all students. Jim, what about you?
I started with the collective responsibility and accountability and support. I feel like that's something that the sense that I have is people in the room have that collective thought around responsibility, accountability, and support. Begin with this. How do we take that and then get to these other areas for improvement? I did stick with one. I went with basically all three. So I had expectations about having small students, effective partnerships, and the environment and customer staff. And then I went in that direction to really feel like from the leadership standpoint of the board and superintendent, that's where the modeling comes in, that's where the policy board comes in, the all guidance happens, you know, the drive organization.
No, that's okay. That's all right. You wouldn't be the first. Okay. But I like what you said in terms of, if I heard you correctly, taking the last three pieces, grouping them together, collective responsibility, accountability, and support. Because the big thing in the Lighthouse project that we learned when I was a superintendent, but as a board, how do you hold the system accountable and support it at the same time? And that's really at the heart of that. What's the board's role in student achievement? The piece that you see on the paper that we hopefully will get to, but if not, we'll save for another day. But it's that collectiveness. How can I hold you accountable to a very high standard and then of course support you at the same time and being seen as holding you accountable and supporting you at the same time. And so for you, Jill, what I heard you say was then taking those three and making sure that we're raising our expectations and environment, trust and respect and those partnerships. So doing it together. So we do it very collaboratively. Good. Kimberly, what do you think? When you look at that statement, what would you encourage everyone, including yourself, to work on?
I'm just still on the learning curve. Learning over our grades and all that goes on with it.
So you're still in that lead and learn together piece. You're
Yeah.
still doing a lot of learning.
Yeah.
Great, Rusty.
Me too. absolute clarity on what that shared focus and what those high expectations actually are. Because I'm not sure I know. I know generally, but I don't know that I know specific what that looks like when we're done. Which will never be done, but at least what we want it to look like.
Good, thank you for pointing that out. Because I see a major role for, again, school boards in general, and yours may be crystal clear, but I always challenge boards to be as clear as possible with what I call strategic direction. What is the board's strategic direction / vision for the district? Because from there, superintendent can go away and build that strategic plan, make it operational, and that's part of that partnership between board and superintendent. Board doesn't set with the superintendent's help, that strong vision, direction, then everything else is going to fall. Now, again, I don't know you well enough to know, is that crystal clear? Could that be better? Is that something you could work on? And that's a conversation. And what I'm hearing Rusty say is, it could be clearer for me. And maybe that's something that we spend some time and energy in. Good. All right. Did everybody get a chance to weigh in? Anybody have a follow-up comment? I appreciate you going through that exercise, both the strengths and the areas of growth. Again, you've got a copy of this definition. It's on that first handout. The second handout, as I walk around, this is the piece we're going to get into next, was just kind of a brief summary of Tom Alsbury's 12 standards. Because you're going to hear me refer to those 12 standards throughout the next little bit. If you have a description of those, I'll refer you to those. We're going to go to standard 11, which is really at the heart of roles and responsibility. I'll say it now because I'm thinking of it and I don't want to forget it for later, but a very good instrument that we have adopted in this last year, and it's a change from an instrument we used before, is the board self-assessment tool. Is based on these 12 standards. So if you read through these and you'd like to know more about how does the board perceive itself in this work, we have a self-assessment tool that will take you through all 12 standards. So just something to consider there. And I've got a more detailed document of those 12 standards if you want. But let's move on. The board standards, those are the ones that I referred to a moment ago. These are 6 of them. Again, I'm sorry, it's not showing up very well. I don't know if it's my background, or it's my background on the wall, but cultural responsiveness, vision directed planning, culture, climate accountability, community engagement. You can see here already some of the things that we've already talked about as part of some of these standards and what they look like. And it goes on to talk about your effective leadership, budgeting, of course, how to be a learning organization. That's the lead and learn together. So you've got all of these standards that we're not going to delve into deeply tonight, but I wanted you to know that they exist. And there is work that we can do together to better understand all 12 of these standards. So this is the one that leads us into roles and responsibilities. The standard 11. I think what I have up on the screen up there is pretty close to what you have in front of you, so it's easier to read. Go ahead and just look at it off your paper. But it really starts here. Because all those other areas and all those other standards, and I've talked to multiple researchers over the years, and they say, if it's not a functional board superintendent relationship or team, forget everything else and work on that relationship. You know, the strategic direction and all the other things that we've kind of thrown out there. If you've got a either dysfunctional board or a dysfunctional board superintendent relationship, work on that first. And so that's where roles and responsibilities, understanding your roles, how you work together, and so forth and so on is so important. That's what's embodied in this particular standard. All right, I'm going to press on so I can hopefully get some questions from you and we'll start talking about specifics. So, big picture. We have to draw broad strokes on role of the board versus the role of the superintendent. These two words come to mind. Board is around governance. Excuse me. Superintendent is around management. Another way to say that is board determines the what, superintendent determines the how. Or ends versus needs is another way to say it. You determine outcomes, ends, the superintendent and his team determines the means. Now, that doesn't mean that you guys work in isolation, okay? There's overlap, there's conversation, but who's broadly responsible for which side of this equation? So let's go, let's look at this first. Or primarily, you have duties around policy and advocacy and setting goals. That's the key direction I talked about a moment ago. The superintendent, operations, personnel, regulations. Why the red arrows and why do they only seem to move from the superintendent into the board? I mean, right now I've got it kind of divided in black and white, but why the red arrows? Anyone want to venture a guess?
Yes. I would say because the superintendent advisor a good word, and you don't know the nitty gritty and details. And then you know some of that, but you know how to do it.
That's exactly right. That's a great guess. All right. This is to illustrate that the board rarely works in isolation from the superintendent, because you need those recommendations, you need that information, set good goals, set good policies, so forth and so on. It's not a double-headed arrow, because rarely will the superintendent confer with the board on any of the detailed works. So it doesn't, it's not a two-way street. I also like the next part of the slide because I wish things were this black and white when we talk about roles and responsibilities, but it's much muddier than that. And my encouragement is when you get to those issues and you're not sure, is this a board responsibility or is it superintendent responsibility? One, look and see if you have a policy around whatever that particular issue might be. And if there's no guidance there, then bringing it up at an open board meeting with your superintendent and having that conversation. Very early in my superintendency in South Umpqua, an issue arose around the colors at the high school. It's very all the details, very interesting though. A couple of prominent boosters came in and said, you know, colors aren't right, colors are supposed to be this, you know, demanding changes and so forth, so on, so on. So I'm brand new first year superintendent, so I go to my board. We don't have a policy that covers who's going to decide about, you know, this wasn't the high school mascot, but it was the school colors, so it was second, right? We sat down, we had a conversation. In the end, what we decided together as a group was, superintendent, you take on the issue. Do what you need to do, make whatever decisions you need to make. If they want to appeal to us, fine, we've got a process for that. But we sat down, we determined, very easily, it could have been the board said, no, we got to weigh in on that. And so you bring us the information, we'll make a board decision. So when in doubt, sometimes you got to have conversations around whose role, whose responsibility this could be. And of course, I kept the board informed afterwards of the decision. I ruled against my two prominent boosters. I got back on my board and I lost a lot of money from two prominent boosters. That's the short story. Over the colors. And it was the color of gold because it was supposed to be old gold. But my staff and my kids and many other people preferred the Vegas gold. It's a true story. It's a true story. Anyway, sorry, but
Maybe this was coming, but would you define policy?
Yeah. Not very well.
Because when you said that, my initial response, well, that's easy. That's not policy. That's the school colors.
Right.
We think school colors would be policy. Whether or not you have colors, it seems to me.
It could be, there wasn't anything on that, you're right, we went to the policy, I went to the policy. You know, do I have any guidance here? And there was none, so there was no policy to guide that particular issue. All right, many times school mascot, same thing. You know, there's no specific policy, so if it's not in the policy handbook.
I guess that's the question that I have, and again, maybe we'll get there, but determining what is policy. Something arises, is that policy or not? Well, unless you know what policy means.
Well, policy is, in terms of board policy, it's written, what you have in writing, that is your policy.
Okay. Anything
Anything that's not there is not policy, as far as the board's concerned. Now, there's procedures, there's frameworks, there's a lot of paperwork, if you will, frameworks, procedures underneath policy that belongs to the superintendent. Now, sometimes we throw the word policy around kind of loosely, but I would say policies, what you have in writing, that's your policy.
That's all.
Okay, good, all right. Now, we would, and we should, and we will talk about administrative regulations in just a moment.
And that's right after you have to clarify with people when they'll throw out what is your policy. And I know that it's not actually the board policy, and it's actually different.
Right.
What they're talking about.
And that's why we throw around the word policy too, is what's the school policy? Well, okay, school policy is different than board policy, right? School policy is probably found in the handbook. All right. But again, I would, to the best of your ability, try to use the policy word only for the board level, or put the word board in front of it. Okay. Good. Yeah, we got some more stories about that. And so, no, that's fine. This is,
District policy and the board. You know, I don't know all the time. And policy, our policy means district.
are you using the words board and district interchangeably?
I guess I said the
Okay.
board is part of the district. And so is it, we're all
Yeah.
working together on
Our-
the same policy and vote.
Yes, now you may call your board policies district policies, that's fine. But those are the big policies that you approve.
Yes.
Okay. Right,
If we start saying, well, the board policy is what they vote.
or district policy, okay, but just be careful because some of the policies, again, don't really like to use that word, but the superintendent has procedures, frameworks, so forth, that could be called policy. What's the superintendent's policy on X, Y, Z? Okay, so as long as you're clear what you mean, yes, district policy is probably the same as board policy.
My other question is, where does practice come into this? I mean, when we do it, the board does things a certain way, but it's not policy. We often say, this is our practice. It's not our policy, but it's our practice. For example, it's our practice to have our chair serve 2 terms. But that's not, it's not our policy, and I don't have to do that.
Correct. If it's not in policy, again, it's fine to have practice, but policy would take a vote of the board to change. Practice does not. So that would be this distinction between the two. And it's important that you understand that it's not in policy. It doesn't exist as far as the law is concerned. Now, that's probably not a legal issue per se, but that would come up.
We've also been advised to be very wary of put in a policy, because whatever the policy can be held legally responsible.
Exactly. Exactly. That's why I say, if it's not in writing, it doesn't exist.
But if it is in writing, it does exist, and so our many members could actually sue the districts to us. At the board, we're not following our policy.
That's exactly right.
So. Be very careful.
Jim, did I see your hand up where you're trying to get my attention? Were you going to say something?
No, I mean, I think it's also important to understand that policies are generally born out, especially board policies, are generally born out of legal statute, in which they say at the board, if we develop a policy, we have a recipe, we'll do that for us. Policies are there to make a problem and perceived problem better, initially solve it, and then they evolve over time. I think there's also, I think as far as the risk of those things, is we just have to keep in mind, were we negligent in going out and openly not following a policy, or were we really acting in good faith? Policy. So now some of those policies, that restrictive harassment policy, is a much different level as far as that quality, because it is more in both levels of state law.
And there are different intents of different policies, right? Sometimes, like Jim said, it's to just solve a problem, if you will, or give framework on how to solve certain problems. Some policies are about outcomes or make sure that you have certain direction on certain things. Let's talk about this next one, because in broad strokes, we're going to talk about kind of the roles of the board and roles of the superintendent. And so as a board, you know that one of your responsibilities is to hire the superintendent. It's up to the superintendent to really hire the rest of the staff. Now, you probably have a policy, GB, on personnel that gives in broad strokes some guidance to the superintendent, but the superintendent then goes away and creates or has what is left and inherited kind of procedures on what the hiring process would be. And you mentioned something, if I can pick on that, on the hiring that happened tonight, and it's always been our practice to have, I thought I heard you say, a community member on the hiring committee.
Yes.
Okay, so it's not in policy, but it is an expectation of the board, and that's what you were saying, Jim.
Oh, I made a mental note of policy. I'm not sure.
Okay. Okay. I didn't connect up to your internet. I probably should have. We could bring the policy up and do that, but yes, you should check that policy, right? But my point here is that there's still a role of the board in terms of hiring staff, but it is in your policy. And you probably have two different policies. You probably have one for hiring administrators, that would be in the C section, and then G is your personnel section. I'm pretty sure you have GB, which is your personnel policy. And for the most part, your policy is broad strokes. And then your superintendent works in details. All right, I think we're going to talk more about policy and ARs in just a moment, but I just wanted to show you the overlap, but in terms of who you hire, who the superintendent hires, everybody else. Just out of curiosity, here you are required to bring licensed staff to the board. Do you bring non-licensed staff to the board here? Okay. Some districts do. You're not required to by law. Some boards only want to see licensed staff in terms of at their board meetings, and they delegate that authority for non-licensed staff to hire without board approval.
Our practice has been to other we approve the finance staff. We're notified of the hiring.
Right. That's a great point. You're notified of, but it doesn't require your action, right? So just because something's the role of the superintendent doesn't mean that you can't be informed, right? Remember Tom Alsbury, informed oversight, that good relationship. All right, let's press on, because again, I'm hoping some of this will.
If that's the back of my point, sorry.
No, this is about you, Wilda. I don't have.
Hires. Hires the staff. And I know that. So we've had occasion on the board. Years or so where it's been hired as one member, actually doesn't approve of it like that person and knows something about them. Or this isn't going to be the hire. And so they voted no in hiring. And it's my understanding can't do that. But we can, only will know if the policy hasn't been followed at higher level. But we can't deny individuals hierarchy, if we don't have that.
Well, there's a difference between can't and should. Can you vote no against the superintendent's recommendation? Yes.
For any reason whatsoever.
There's no prohibition for you to vote no. I'm not saying you should, right? There's a can you and should you component to a lot of this work. And that's actually my next thing here, approve contracts. No, I'm sorry, it's not. So,
I think going to the hiring of the staff is a great topic, whether it's in the hiring or the retreat, is to know the background as far as how you got to the point of wanting to member on. Because there's got, my biggest trick is there's got to be some backstories how we got there. And it's usually born out of let's say hiring a supervisor who doesn't fully understand how to kind of decision how to put together a screening board, staffs, how to separate the duties between one committee does half the year, another committee does the actual interviews, actually that kind of process.
yeah, perhaps and I don't want to get too deep there, because my question would be, well, okay, but yeah, we should say that for another day. I want to come back to what, because you're making an excellent point in terms of superintendent brings a recommendation, right? Okay, so this is my coaching the school boards. Be very careful in not supporting the recommendation of your superintendent, unless it falls under three categories. And this is what you were alluding to. Okay, one is was policy followed? You know, there's policy procedures. Was that followed for this individual? If it wasn't, then regardless of your feelings about the individual, then you would have the right, if you will, the ability to push back on the superintendent. We didn't follow our policy. I can't approve this hire. Okay, so that's one. Two is there's something about the contract, because all boards, the reason licensed staff comes to you and non-licensed doesn't is because the contract that comes with some of those licensed positions. Now, collective bargaining agreement is going to be a little bit different, but there's something in the contract that you oppose. And so I can't approve this hire because of this part of this particular contract. Now that rarely comes up because again, collective bargaining agreements are in place, and as long as you follow those. And now I just lost the third one. Oh, whether it's in the budget or not. Was this position budgeted? All right. So if you have grounds to deny the recommendation based on basically procedural issues, yes, absolutely. Can you reject a recommendation based on your personal preference? And like you heard me say a moment ago, yes, you can, but no, you shouldn't. Because whatever information that you have in terms of a personal preference about an individual, I guarantee you that you gathered it outside the employment process. You have some information that wasn't a part of that employment process that you're bringing to the table, and you're denying somebody's employment. I believe, and what I coach boards to think about is, am I opening the can of worms to an unlawful, discrimination or employment or whatever that might be? Where did your information come from? Well, I just happen to know Steve Kelly, and I know he's a low life and yada, 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 yada. Well, somehow I made it through the entire process. I got the recommendation of your superintendent. So you got to be careful with that. So, but yes, there are some procedural things that you can inquire about, push back on. But I would say without one of those three good reasons that you approve that recommendation from your superintendent. Other questions about that? It's a little tricky generically, specific examples. Work a little bit better. But anyway, let's press on. So approved contracts that we just really talked about, employee relationships, approved contracts, the collective bargaining agreement is important. Obviously, that's between the board and the unions, but it's up to the superintendent to administer those contracts, those employee relationships, operationalize it, if you will. We talked about this a little bit. This is an area I find lacking in a lot of the boards that I work with. Clear vision, goals, what I call that strategic direction. Because without it, you really board have little or no impact on student achievement in a positive way. And again, we can talk more about that if we get to that last handout. But once you do have that strategic direction, then it's important for the superintendent to turn that into action. Usually that's the strategic plan. That operationalizes your strategic direction. Tell me a little bit about, I know I'm kind of getting ahead of myself, strategic plan. What's your history there, board? Do you have one? Is that something the board does? Is that something the superintendent does?
I think at one point we were talking about, going through the process of developing that, then we had to go into hiring a new superintendent instead. Because we got to that point because we had identified there wasn't really a strategy or vision. I mean, we've got our mission statement, but beyond that, you know, I assume that when we're talking about the strategy, goals, vision is going to be more specific than what our.
Did you concur that's kind of a statement?
I'm not sure it's entirely right. Everything's absolutely accurate. We've had the personnel group committee since the probably 1990s. Now, off and on, some years stronger, some years less. That committee is consistent of 2 committee members and about 2 staff members and an admin team. It's met 3, 4, 5% a year. Talk about what we did right, what we do better. What are we calling it? So it's not as, I think what the board wanted to do. Proceed with have a sort of codify that and make it stronger. So we've always had that same administration.
So what I would say in very broad strokes, again, not to get too far ahead of me, okay, other things that I know you want to talk about. It's very important that the board, along with superintendent and this committee, set a clear strategic direction. 2 or 3 priorities that would fulfill that mission based on, you know, the data and understanding your kids and your community and so forth, so on and so on. Once the board does that, then you hand it off to the superintendent. Let him and his team build the strategic plan, then comes back to the board for your information. So there's an entire process here that's captured in that first handout that I gave you. And so if we don't get there tonight, we absolutely need to get back to this, because either myself or my team is absolutely committed on it.
I think you have, like maybe 5 years ago, when we first there, we developed goals in conjunction with the team. That team came to the board meeting, we all got the other table, worked out goals we wanted, what data points we wanted to show for them.
Okay.
And we were following that, but not too stable.
Okay.
So that's why I wanted to do.
Perfect. Then perfect. We'd love to help in that. So you guys just let us know. We'll press on. DOS policy, we kind of talked about this, develops administrative regulations. Board, how do you handle what we call ARs or administrative regulations? Do you approve those? Are they given to you just for information? Policy, we know it comes to the board, you adopt it. It's part of your policy, but what about administrative regulations? What's your practice?
Our previous superintendent just brought those to our attention. And made it clear, no uncertain terms, that we don't approve this.
Okay. Yeah. All right, so that's my coaching is ARs. You can be informed, you should be informed, but they are not for your approval, because if you approve them, they're no longer ARs, they're policy. And only can be changed if they come back to the board. Now, there are some, and OSBA and Spencer and his team do a wonderful job. Some federal flow-through policies that have required ARs to go with them, that have to be approved by the board. And why the feds call them ARs, I don't know why, but all that's very clear in the information that you get from OSBA. But 95% of your ARs are up to your superintendent. And in all likelihood, you have a policy around ARs, and it probably says that you will be showing those ARs. And if you disagree with, if you don't think the AR supports the policy, then give that feedback to your superintendent. Say, we're not quite sure this matches. Here's why. Let's have a conversation. All right, please go away and fix it. So you can influence them, but stop short of trying to approve those. Those are the details. See, to me, this whole policy versus AR piece is that governance versus manager or management, big picture versus the operational side of things. All right, sets the budget. You guys know that. Your superintendent plans the expenditures, monitors progress, and reports progress. These last two pieces here, once you've set your strategic direction, once you have your strategic plan, there's this entire framework that I would love to take you through that is important for the board to monitor the progress of the strategic plan, and more importantly, your strategic direction. There's a very interactive process that can be created so that you sit down with people that are in the trenches, hear their stories, talk about data. That's how you monitor progress. It's not just getting a report each month at a board meeting. That can be a part of it, but there's a big interactive piece. That piece in my district in South Umpqua fundamentally changed the culture of that district. Because my board sat beside teachers, administrators 2 or 3 times a year. We looked at key data, not all data, and not operational data, but high-level data, and had conversation about kids. My teachers walked away saying, I didn't know the board cared about student achievement. I didn't know who my board members were, okay, some of them. And some of my board members said, I just didn't know. I just didn't know this challenge or that challenge or so forth and so on. And because my board had those conversations, they were holding the system accountable. And at the same time, they were coached, how can we support you? What do you need? And they're connecting directly with our teacher leaders. So entire different segment on all of that, but there is a way to do that. So in broad strokes. Oh, okay. I'll do that next. Thoughts, questions? We talked about roles and responsibilities. I've been doing way too much of the talking. What questions do you have? What scenarios? What things Steve, this is board work, is it not board work? And it doesn't have to fit in all those categories, but those are just a broad stroke.
What's the process for the board and superintendent to engage with staff? Maybe we're learning targets, like in the map on the track, attend the graduation, and attendance data. Then being able to come back together to, I think, hold that information that board that received from the teacher, because it may not be that.
So let's see, I understand your scenario correctly. So a board member and superintendent talk with the individual teacher.
And I talk with the three that outlines the open South Umpqua. And out of that, you have individual teachers saying, these are my challenges, or these are our challenges. That might not be the challenge for the entire district. We have just for a particular teacher or a group of teachers and the rest of the thing. How does that interaction work to be able to come back? To be able to vet that information, make sure that the decisions that we're making is still aligned correctly, this way the correct data. Information going to which.
A couple different dynamics there. In South Umpqua, the folks that the board worked with were our teacher leaders. And so they were designated by their staffs, had job descriptions, were paid stipend, and these were teacher leaders and people that had a lot of credibility in terms of what they shared with the board. We debriefed as a group, after these individual kind of conversations. And then I would always the next month at board work session, what did we hear? Are we going to support, and we would debrief it as a board as well. So there was opportunities to kind of take that information and make sure you don't get too far afield because one particular teacher saw the world a particular way. We really look for patterns in the conversation. That's how we do that. Other thoughts, questions? Is this all sounding?
It sounds super easy until it's not.
Until it's not. That's what I'm trying to dig up here is what's the not? What's the sticky wicket? Let me press on here. Go ahead.
I can tell you that it gets difficult when you start to set goals and visions. And then how do we monitor and report progress? That becomes very difficult. At the same time, when you set goals and vision, I think it really becomes the role of this is where that partnership happens, where it's super, I believe this is that helps drive it. Is what does the accountability look like if we just don't track? And then what are the agreements comes to the board to kind of hold each other accountable? And so this is, oh boy, I sure want this, and they say, does it align with our meeting the goals and visions?
So let's talk about that for just a bit, because Jim, I think that's a great question, because the goals and vision is that strategic direction, but where you get your accountability board is making sure that there's a strategic plan. And again, it's the responsibility of the superintendent to put it together, because it's going to have goals, objectives, strategies, materials needed, how you're going to evaluate, a lot of details. And so you've got to make sure such a document exists. And so once you set the direction, okay, Mr. Superintendent, go away and create this document, come back in whatever, X number of months, and you report to the board. And then you have a conversation. Superintendent says, here's what we have, this is what my team has developed. What do you think? And then board, you've got to not approve the strategic plan, but make sure it aligns with the direction. And when you do that, then basically you're giving your superintendent that blessing, go forth, make it happen. But then, as part of this monitoring framework, every board meeting, you should be getting not an entire report on everything in the strategic plan, but different parts of the strategic plan. You should be able to draw a line between the strategic plan and your agenda at a board meeting. And if you're spending time on anything else, and I know I'm going to hit a nerve here, this is when I usually get kicked under the table if I'm close to somebody. Okay. That's not having an impact on student achievement. But if you're talking about kids, if you're talking about your strategic plan and the progress thereof or lack of progress, now you're impacting student achievement. But again, without getting into the details, I'm really getting myself in trouble. Are there things on your agenda that you can't tie directly to your strategic plan? And of course, you got to have a strategic plan first, right? I don't know if you do or you don't, but assuming you don't, that's your first order of business. But then try to mold that agenda, or at least half your time. Your agenda items, this agenda item clearly is attached to this part of our strategic plan. And your strategic plan is strategically focused on your priorities. So that's that accountability piece, Jim. That's how you stay on track, in my opinion. Now, the other piece of that monitoring is to periodically sit down with what you call it, Wilbur.
15.
The fifth. Okay, all right. Your fifth, you got your improvement team, PHIP, right? Pleasant Hill. Okay, I got it now. Fifth, I'm got F. Where are we getting F there? Okay, fifth. I got it. I'm a little slow, but I'm getting there. I'm getting there. So this improvement team, again, well, is that a committee of the board or a committee of the superintendent?
Very interesting question. That's what we wanted to do.
Okay.
We let that fuzzy. But I'd like to point out real quick, if I can, this paper I carry around in my school notebook, we did the Pleasant Hill School District goals scorecard. It has this, our three goals, which were relationship, literacy, and engagement.
Yeah, I remember that.
We have the goal, we have, and then we have the ways we're going to monitor it. And then we have the date, the board meeting date, and we're going to have the report. And that was when we first did this out, 6. It was really good, the first year or so. And after that, it evolved into a report instead of having 15 come, all of them was just a report. You know,
Yep.
and this got a little bigger and bigger. So we still have it, it's still in place, but it's not particularly.
Okay, good.
I did not even know who did that.
So that's something, that's a conversation I'd like to see you revise. Not revise, revive, okay? Because it's that active piece of the board. Getting your hands dirty, talking with teachers, looking at data. It's much more than a report. The report that we talked about, again, all of this is summarized on that first page that I gave you that's got collaborative governance at the top. All of this is outlined there. You should be getting periodic reports, having some type of conversation at board meetings. But what Will was talking about, and I think I was the one that helped coach you on that way back in the beginning, is this interaction with the 15. Again, board chooses what high level data, what's key data that's important to you. So you get to choose the data.
We did.
Right. What's important to this board, but you got to do that every year. You got to revisit that every year. And it's got to become part of your framework, part of your culture. So that's what we mean by monitors progress. That's a little different than monitoring the strategic plan. And again, to set that strategic direction, you should do it collaboratively. And again, either myself or my team, we've done this for years now. We're better at it now. I would strongly encourage that once Jim kind of, again, I know you're super new with what's going on, but if that's something that appeals to you and the board, we'd love to be able to help with that. All right, let's press on. I wanted to look at your policy because here's another place where we talk about roles and responsibilities. And it's under BBF, it's under board member standards of conduct. And if you're not familiar with this, please make sure that you are. It's pretty up to date. It was revised in 11320. And really the whole B section, and I would say for superintendents, new board members with experience that maybe just want to go back and review, but above your policy handbook, the A/B section is what pertains to the board. So read through there, be familiar with that. And this is the piece that talks about, I think to some degree, some roles and responsibilities. Talks about treating other board members, staff, public with respect. We kind of talked about that. You're strong in that area. Your personal opinions. When we talk about communication protocols, it's important as a board member that when you're a single board member, you're not expressing, you don't have your board member hat on, you're expressing a personal opinion. And sometimes that can get fuzzy or muddy. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a moment. Board members will not post confidential information. Yeah, that's probably, there was something here. Oh, and of course, that last paragraph, you are mandatory reporters to child abuse, that was probably the addition in 20. Any questions, thoughts? A lot of that is just around communication. All right, I'm going to press on because I think we're probably halfway through our time. More than halfway. So, as we said, you govern, superintendent manages. We're going to transition us into communication protocols. But before I do, Questions, thoughts, roles and responsibilities? Situations, specific examples, even hypothetical ones, even if they're not. We do this while I'm thinking about it. I think I've given this to you before, but this is for everybody in the room. When you have questions, as it pertains to your board work, not that I have all the answers, but I can be your gateway to other people in the organization that can help you find the answers. So if you want to start with somebody, start with me, and my phone number is 541 401 3962. 541 401 3962. You can call me, you can email me, and I'll get back to you, right? Okay. So while we're here, I think I always say that, and then I jinx myself. So we're talking about roles and responsibilities. So let's talk about the advisory committee question, and then we'll move into communication protocols. So is there a specific question, or do you want me to broad stroke the advisory committee piece? Is there a specific question that lies under that?
Well, I said the question was hard. I understand that the board committee, that, probably and announce the meeting for the superintendent, I think, superintendent doesn't have to do that.
That's correct. So if it is an advisory committee to the board, then they must follow all the public meeting laws, just as the board. If it's an advisory committee to the superintendent, they do not. So the 10-cent question becomes, what makes an advisory committee to the board? Or the superintendent, but the trickier one is to the board because they have to follow public meeting laws. What makes an advisory committee to the board?
Well,
So the one example is chat committee was looking at a specific board policy. And there was questions that were being taken about the policy from one of those recommendations and then not. So the difference is, can the committee make policy recommendations to the superintendent, or does that matter if they're talking about a policy that goes to the board? And where that gray line is at.
What was the name of this committee again?
It's our health committee.
Your health. Okay, so your health committee. The short answer is yes, they can make a recommendation to you on a board policy. Because really the key difference or the key distinguishing factor is an advisory committee to the board makes their recommendations directly to the board. Their work is directly with the board. If the committee is making recommendations to the superintendent, then it's an advisory committee to the superintendent. Now, please don't use the workaround. Well, we'll just flow the information through the superintendent so it gets to the board so we don't have to meet in public. No, the superintendent has to be able to take that recommendation as input, change it if needed, but then can make it to the board.
So what was our budget committee? That's the only one I can recall since I've been on the board from that. In terms of any advisory, committee. They came to us, as I recall, recommended to us that we adopt the budget. Did they not?
yes,
It's every year.
we follow the name.
So did they have to be in public when they were discussing the budget? And they did, okay. So that was a,
By law, you're required to have a budget committee.
right,
Right.
board is,
The board.
the superintendent.
Right. The board is required by law. This is one that is specifically set up by the law. With a 5-person board, so you have a 5-person budget committee. And there's some rules and regulations around that. But yes, that's a good example. And usually that budget committee will work with the board, so usually a group of 10 is how most places do it. But yes, if that committee were to get together separately away from the board, then that is an advisory committee to the board. Go ahead.
And the good committee, but the improvement
Mhm.
is acting like a superintendent. I don't know if we are or not. They haven't, mine, you know, all that.
The 10-cent question, or the question to ask is, when that group meets, who gets the information? And if it's to the superintendent, then it's an advisory committee to the superintendent. If that information comes directly to the board, then they would be an advisory committee to the board. So where does that information go?
If it came to the board, then you're presenting right to the board chair.
Well, it would come to the board chair, so that can be placed on an agenda that comes to the board.
So
Right.
wouldn't necessarily have to involve.
Well, if it's an advisory committee to the superintendent,
No,
right, if it's an advisory committee to the board, it doesn't necessarily involve the superintendent. No.
so Jim, would you say maybe we have a superintendent? I'm a little leery about workaround. It sounds to me like, you know, they're.
Well,
Part
here,
of that is, part of that is rooted in recommendations. As far as going out and getting input from the staff.
so who controls the composition of the fifth committee? Who determines the membership?
That's where there's loosely an administrative procedures that outline with the superintendent in our district. I would say there's nothing written, but it will go back. In our district, it works like this. We actually post the position, department head chair. Teachers can apply for it. Once they've got it, it's theirs until they choose to give it up or we go through the process of removing. Part of removing that is like an employment clause because we're actually paying them now. And it's, we're in a lot of difficulty versus having a rule setups where every year the administrator or the principal will seek input as far as teachers remember what they know. Every year we have to reapply for their position.
That's a teacher by that. There's all the, you know, the other. I look at it as a board member.
Yeah, you're the,
And in years past, we've had 3, 4, 5 committee members. From that and other.
but this I have, you're the only.
Right. But I think it's preferable. Because I think historically that committee has been rather than.
Yeah, I think that's part of the discussion, I think, with the board of superintendents, what, when you say community engagement, what does community engagement mean? Does community engagement mean that for every single community you have, there will be a community member on that? Or does community engagement mean that part of our community is our teaching staff, part of the community is a classified staff, part of our community, might be like, I think if we revise the community, well, and then we might even have part of the community all together in the same. Let's bring up so the equity advisory committee we've been talking about. That is looking at the statute, that is a superintendent appointed position. That advises the superintendent on that will also procedure information.
So if that committee, both all, you know, so then I'm assuming our fifth committee would be also. Yes, so then,
Whereas I think the budget committee, it's really what you point, who's on the budget.
Yes, and what I heard described, your fifth committee is superintendent's advisory committee. Given that everything that you explained there, that truly is information that goes to the superintendent. And if there's any doubt, board, I would just make it very clear for the world, but that is superintendent's advisory committee. And let him deal with all the things that he just talked about, and the composition and so forth and so
And a good note, maybe, also.
on. The what, say it again?
Good note.
Yes. 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 An example of an advisory committee to the board that I've seen in other places, I'm not advocating for this per se, it's just an example, is a policy subcommittee. Where policies go first to get worked. Superintendent can be a part, usually they are, other key staff are, but then that policy committee then reports directly back to the board. In that scenario. Superintendent doesn't take those recommendations, change them if needed, and then present them to the board. So that's an example of an advisory committee that reports directly to the board. There are sometimes useful advisory committees to the board. My coaching of boards is if you want to create one, don't have any long-term standing subcommittees of the board. That just muddies the water over time. Everybody kind of forgets why the committee was formed and so forth and so on. But that if you need to create an advisory committee, that by resolution, which would be very clear what your intentions are, what are the duties of the advisory committee, what decision making, what kind of recommendations do you expect, when's the start date, when's the end date, so forth and so on. So just be very clear what the role of that advisory committee is.
We had advisory to the board and the contest bonds.
That'd be another one. Yep. Anytime that information goes directly to the board, that's considered advisory committee of the board, and as we said in the beginning, the public meeting laws that apply. Okay, anything else around advisory committees? Because again, that was a very specific question that I got from somebody that said, hey, we want to talk about this. Now I know we're shooting to try to end around 8 o'clock. It's about 7:30 or so. We need to take a quick break, or we're gonna try to stretch it out and see where we're at 8 o'clock. How are you feeling?
Anybody need a break?
So if I can, let me look at the exact time. Yeah, okay, 7:30. You might be able to 2 birds, 1 stone here. There was some desire to at least begin conversation, if not create a board superintendent operating agreement. There was a sample sent, I think, ahead of time. Built on our collaborative governance kind of definition. So we can talk a bit about communication and protocols within that. But I also, again, just want to draw your attention to what I found on your website. And I found this late in the game, but I thought I better bring it. You got it. All right. And do what? I was just gonna say, it looks like familiar handiwork. And I think this was probably developed right after we hired your previous superintendent, because I usually go through this exercise of what's the expectations, superintendent of the board and board of the superintendent. Which again, I'm happy to do that exercise. But anyway, I just wanted to show you, this is what you had. It was recently readopted. I want to say the date on it was like 2021. No. When I looked on your website, it was much more recent. You may have readopted it. Very good. Oh, there we go. Oh, sorry. All right. So it wasn't your board back.
No.
Okay, all right. So Jim found basically what I found in your website, and I think it was, I'm pretty standing on there, but I thought it's 21, August of 21. Okay. So that is your current operating agreement. Do you want to start with it? Do you want to possibly modify it? Obviously, you've got a new superintendent now. Jim, you may have some thoughts. You may have brought an example tonight. You want to discuss the example that I shared with you. How would you like to proceed around this board operating agreement?
If it ain't fixed, we're open, don't fix it.
Well, this wasn't a big with a different superintendent. So I don't know, them are the same as Scott.
Well, I look at this now, and I think there's not sure there's anything on there. I read through the one that you provided, much more thorough. Don't sure of any of that either, so I guess I don't. I don't have a burning need to change what we have, but if there's something that feels like it's missing, then it's problematic.
I like the one that you provided is a little more comprehensive, a little more detailed.
And if you'll notice, and again, I'm not trying to sell mine, and I'm fine going either direction, but if you'll notice on the back of the one that I sent, there is a space for expectations. And so you could actually look at some of those expectations and say those still apply, and you can plug it in here if you like this particular document. Or I can take you through that exercise like I did a few years ago. You can come up with your new expectations to fill in those blanks.
I was puzzled by that because it looks to me like this document outlines the expectations.
This one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What you provided, it seemed to me that that was the expectations. So.
Yes.
We add to it. That isn't already there.
Good point. I mean, if there was something specific that perhaps was missing. Like I said, I have this other exercise that I do with boards that's where those came from. But again, I want to use your time wisely tonight. One of the reasons I sent this as an example, because I knew part of what we we're going to talk about is communication protocols. And if you notice in this document, it has some guidance around communication, the whole section on communication agreements. And so when you look through 1 through 5, it talks about those protocols. So that's why I was saying 2 birds in 1 stone might get at what you were wanting tonight.
I like on Jim's.
I think David mentioned, I like the more detailed example that you provide. And I think, Russ, your point is that I think that this is kind of meant to be kind of a working document that we can go through. We're fortunate, I think, right now that we're like, we've got a functioning board. There's a board in our area right now that is not functioning well, and we'll get like an example. That's provided, the board shall support any decisions of the majority honoring the right of the individual members of the viewpoints. That is something I think is an expectation that is not clear to this board at this point in time, but it became essential. So imagine 3 years from now, or 4 years from now, to revisit. Yeah, also the idea is that this is generally a working document. It's a good to revisit the future. But I do like the more.
I do want to just reinforce what Jim said. I hate to tell myself, but I guess I will. When I was superintendent, we had an operating agreement. 7 pages long. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Hey, I was young and foolish. What can I say? But it was good in the fact that every July, as part of a reorganization meeting, that we would go through that document and I would tell my board, this is what worked really well. And this is what we need to work on. And I wish I'd done it, more often, but we had a good relationship. We were fine. But I like the fact that we sat down every year and we talked about the document, albeit 7 pages long. It was double spaced, so, you know. But it was a good conversation to have once a year. So I just wanted to reinforce what Jim said in terms of it's a working document. You got to pay attention to it. You got to give your board feedback. Now, yes, it has to be in a public meeting and you can't go to executive session to give your board bad news if they're not living up to their agreement. Also, you don't have to wait until July. I mean, if something's awry, superintendent, or this is also for board members to hold each other accountable. Hey, as per our operating agreement, you know, you're not living up to this part. So quickly, before we go back and talk about the document, so what do you do when a board member doesn't follow it? Okay, generally speaking, you go to the board chair. The board chair then talks with that individual board member. It's one-on-one, it's outside a public meeting. Hey, this is what we agreed to. And Jim's also right in that this may not apply to you today, but because this document lives on, I mean, you know, the one we created 6 years ago, it still lives on, right? Then new generation of board members coming on, this is what's going to guide them. And you never know what you're going to inherit over time, so to speak, as a superintendent. So it's important as part of your culture to put important pieces, even though you're doing a good job on them today.
Yes, it's important to have, it's important to put it in writing, but we don't revisit it, to sit on the shelf, you have to pass it.
I completely agree with that. That's right.
So I think, even once a year, I just like to read our mission statement every meeting. We could read one other portion of that, or the other one other portion of that every month. That's all it is, you know, standard on to whatever. Yeah. And any comments, or those who don't have comments, fine, if you have any concern.
I talked about self-assessment as well. Is that self-assessment generally taken into use?
The self-assessment that we administer is based on the 12 standards. And from those 12 standards, I can clearly draw a straight line to any one of these things that are here. If this is what is built on those. What we try to pull out and put into basically a one-page document. The back side is, again, for specific expectations or things that you want to add on to. But we really try to kind of narrow it down. And so like under communication agreements, you know, chain of command is always a big one, so we put that in. You know, because if you've got a board member that's not following the chain of command, I like your idea about periodically saying, is there anything in our operating agreement that we need to revisit? Or place on the agenda for next month, or, you know, I've also had boards make this into a placemat. So their operating agreement's right there, or at OSBA, we put our operating agreement on the back of our we have name tags. And so the names here, and what you see as board member is basically the operating agreement. So there's different ways to keep this in front of the board. So here's number 2. All right. Board members shall communicate directly to the superintendent or board chair prior to meetings of the board to address questions or concerns about agenda items. Is that your practice? It's okay to say no, because a lot of places the answer is no.
I think it depends. I mean, it is really something straightforward, like tonight, we're asked about the hiring process for that one employee. You know, it's just a relatively quick and easy answer. You know, if it's something along the lines where we're asked for, you know, specific data, then I think we do a good job of reaching out to the superintendent to say, hey, for this next meeting, you'd be prepared to talk about this.
Okay.
I don't know that it's really been something that's come up this year, just it's because of the circumstances, but I think in the past, that's been my experience.
Everybody kind of agree? James, that been your experience so far? I know you've only been here a couple of meetings.
We are still new. And what I intend to do is anticipate. You know, provide your emails And we use a gold paper as well, and follow as far as guiding document to walk us through the. I think it's sort of a couple of. This is a couple of pieces. It is consistent information for the board as far as. I go through the agenda. But there's a good deal of the as far as making sure that again, we have consistent communication. Whether it's consistent information. I don't know, like, say John being chair, Steve vice chair, will sit down and we don't have a spice of this. I know I'm fine with it. That's set it next to Jim. What I wonder is, are we getting the agenda to ahead of time with the packet to actually have time to review it, or we need to increase that time? And then I think just having get to know each other, probably not over because they're doing less than opportunity. The rest of it is perhaps a little better. I don't know, as far as setting up that, we have a communication with the rest of that. So some time.
I completely understand. I'm gonna come back to Stephen's comment. Will, you were set to say something?
I was just thinking that. You are very new to us. And I really have to come. I read your, I like the communication a whole lot. It's very helpful. And there's nothing, there hasn't really been anything for me at this point. At that probably people that haven't been much patience. The previous 5 years were different superintendents. All of these different things. Haven't changed. The question on that. I'm concerned about one of these information. So I think I would be comfortable doing that. I do that with you too. If the issue was that I have to do anything. And I like you. Giving you all the new things you're doing with. That might be really with something else. I think that's our practice.
Well, the practice that you described is clearly what's in here in the operating agreement. And I'm gonna go back to what Stephen said. Because I think the spirit of what's here is to try not to surprise your superintendent. Just as you don't want the superintendent to surprise you during the board meeting. Real quick funny story, but it's going to illustrate the point I'm trying to make here. But I think it's very important that as a superintendent, we want to try to be prepared for our meetings. And so if you have questions, we would love to get them ahead of time to be prepared for, and if it seems pretty simple and straightforward, yeah, of course we can take it during the meeting. But I would just say, when in doubt, try to communicate with your superintendent. So anyway, this was in our operating agreement at South Oklahoma. And the next day, and this was like Jim, I was really new. Bob was his name. He called me the next day and said, yeah, Steve, I know we talked about this last night, but I just don't like this idea of I gotta, ask all my questions of you before the meeting, and then we don't get to ask them during the meeting. I'm like, no, Bob, that wasn't the intent of that conversation at all. You mean I can ask questions during the meeting? Of course you can. I want you to. I want to have that conversation in public. That I just want to be prepared. And the minute I said that, it was like, oh, okay, I understand what you're after now. You're not trying to hide something. You just want to be prepared. So I wasn't trying to dodge the tough questions, right? And so when he understood that, I mean, he was great. He went on to be a really good one. But the second part of that story, which illustrates what we're talking about here, is we were in a board meeting one time and a different board member. Actually, I was leading some kind of conversation, and he went to say something, and then he stopped. His name was Jeff. And I said, Jeff, what is it? And he said, well, I have a question, but we're supposed to ask you before the meeting. He thought that was the protocol, that he couldn't ask questions during the meeting. And I clarified, well, we all chuckled a little bit. And I said, no. I mean, if things arise, of course, I want you to ask questions during the meeting. It's just if you think of something ahead of time and you can give me a heads up. So that's all it is. It's never perfect and, you know, we've got questions that come up. But the spirit of this is to encourage. And Jim, I love what you just asked. And I had to make this correction in South Oklahoma. Are you getting the information enough ahead of time to be able to look at it and digest it enough so that you can have questions or be prepared for the meeting? So I heard Jim ask the question. I hope I rephrased it correctly, but I didn't hear a response.
I was gonna respond.
Okay, good.
I don't. But we can have, you know, Thursday parties for the meeting. If my schedule isn't too full and I can get to it on a Thursday party, fine. The first outline is just get out busy, so I can't get it out. And I think my job, my responsibility is working, I'm looking at my sometimes I get a Thursday party, I can't get out busy. So it's Saturday or Sunday, on which day it's my money, then it's pretty lazy. For example, this is a very good different selection of ways, so. I got ready to work in, I came across the hackathon, and didn't have a way to hire this person. We've been better call you about it, hey, there's an off meeting, there's a sheet that says what the background is. So I would have talked about that. There wasn't. So earlier, we sure not. I don't think that we.
Well, it's important thing that we did as well as, while there was not a large committee listed together, I see that having, I appreciate the actually did. What we're putting in front of that.
Yeah.
Putting just ours name down there is not representative of the process that we really need a lot of discussion. No.
But had I had a chance. I've been more beautiful than earlier, I could also, you could explain that to me. I someone asked the question that did me just so many minutes. But anyway, better.
So I think to start with, maybe we look at having what I guess out. We should be able to. So we're going to add one.
Any earlier than that is not helpful because. So I love to look at what's been going on. It's great for me. I'll just add, because I noticed the same thing on that. Employment. And my immediate assumption was, oh, that's interesting, you know, whether there must be any good reason not, why not? I asked, well, I didn't. So in some ways, that transparency that there was only one name on there told me, oh, there was only one name on there, there was a good reason. So I had a concern, I certainly would call and ask, they didn't. I just prevent this work.
This would also be the first, even though it's temporary, the first certified hire that I've done since I've been here. So this is beautiful. I mean, as far as what I think if you're accustomed to get you the whole packet. My previous district would not have given this much.
No, we're all, because I've been here the most. Steve, this stuff is super helpful to me. So much of it is like, well, of course. Here we go.
I know, I get it, but if I had plenty of time and probably a different setting and adult beverage, I can tell you stories that'll make your hair red. All right.
There isn't a single thing on it that I'm thinking myself, that's a silly rule. All of them make
Right.
total sense. Completely agree.
Yeah, but let me do one thing. Because no one's standing between me and the door. And I'm gonna voice the question and I'm gonna move us on. Because Will is not gonna like that. The thing I want you to perhaps question and we're having a conversation around. And I'm gonna use this hire as an example. Or how much detail do you really need? How much of it is too much? Because that takes somebody's time to put all that information together to share with you. And it's because you've always done it that way, I'm just challenging you, I don't, well, she's biting her tongue, I get it, and I'm sure there's a reason, all right?
Well, I mean.
I'm sure there's a reason, but it's not board work,
We're
because it's operation, I guarantee you. Go ahead, Steve.
We're talking about page of information, and in terms of time, I mean, I think, experience and education. Yeah, I guess it could be just a nice to know, because ultimately it's. But I remember last school year, we hired somebody for like overseeing curriculum. And there were those were basically blank. There was like one thing on there, and it's like, we're hiring somebody to oversee. They have hardly any experience, no education, that's like wording what's listed here, so, you know. I mean, at the end of the day, yes, the superintendent, hires, everybody else, but. I think when it goes towards, you know, the mission and at some point our strategic planning, you want to be, you want to know as a board member that you're hiring qualified, highly educated individuals, so that's what your superintendent is doing.
Okay, I get we can rationalize it. I get it. I'm sorry. I'm gonna challenge you on this because I would rather you be spending time looking at student data, talking about student achievements, having conversations and using this is what I meant earlier when I said using your time more strategically, because you're looking at all those reports from all those hires. This was just one. What about the beginning of the year when you have a dozen? Think about the time you spend looking at that, calling on the phone, asking about back and forth, and it does take time, even if it's a page, for the superintendent to do. All I'm asking you to do, I'm really not casting stones, but it's just a perfect opportunity to question you on where you spend your time, and it's in the spirit of roles and responsibilities. Because you're asking for a lot of details. Well, I know you and I have had this conversation. Well, of course, because I'm in charge at the moment, right? I mean, no, I really, in the spirit of, and again, I'm not trying to get you to change your ways here, but you've got a new superintendent. I raise it so that you will question what you do, but question it in this lens of roles and responsibilities. So I'm only trying to use the moment to illustrate the roles and responsibilities, because I'm guessing that this level of detail in terms of what you're being given is probably not, without me examining it or having any kind of dialogue, not going to work.
No, you're wrong.
No, I'm not.
First one, hearing report, and about the committee, and somebody said, yeah, I think it's a teacher, what's that about? And I like to be able to say, well, this teacher is comes from, you know, staff, wherever she comes from, wherever. Very pleased that our superintendent is talented and is qualified for their job. If you don't have that information, have it, I don't know, it is hired.
I'm sure our superintendent would be happy to talk to you about that. But what you described, Will, is nice to know.
I don't know about that, if we're approving the hire. We're taking a vote on approving the hire.
So that information that you're given fits in which one of the three categories?
Remind me the three again.
Contract, budget, process. I mean, what you described is basically a resume for each one of the hires.
Well, I mean. Yeah, kind of, it's like an abridged resume. I mean, this is their degree. This is where the degree's from. This is, if they've got any other teaching experience, this is where it's at. And it's.
So what information on that sheet would change your mind to not approve the hire?
Well, what if all I'm getting is this is the class, this is what they're being hired to do, here's the name.
What's wrong with that?
That's generally all you're buying.
That's right. That's right.
So I guess, I mean, to follow where you started, if we're looking at spending our time strategically, I know we discussed this earlier, is this part of our policy, do we even approve these?
But you have to by law because they're a licensed position. That's the quirk of the law.
Yeah, that's what I thought. And
Yeah,
so
it's just
I'm
the quirk.
required to approve it.
And I could understand.
Yeah.
Essentially, yes, because when we get into the idea of this position and making a determination of whether or not this person is actually endorsed directly to do it. Then we,
No, with it.
Let's see, like that.
That's what she does, it's how you down this person.
Go ahead, I said
It's part of the law, it does seem to be a bit of an idiosyncrasy.
it is.
Because if we didn't need the application, which is what you're saying, for the information on it, then we literally would just, we wouldn't even need their name.
No,
We would need to know the superintendent is recommending we hire this position.
But for the record, the name is usually included.
Say it again.
For the record, the name is usually included as far as so that we know that we did include these people, or we include these people, or not include these particular employees. It is interesting as far as the why to get to it, right? Because I can say in a larger district where we may provide in the month of June, we might have 100 hires. And so we'll have a number of pages where it does get the name recommended on there. And it's just name, and it's just the consent agenda.
Yeah.
We've talked more about this one tonight than I can say in the 20-some years.
Don't spend a lot of time doing this. And we really don't. I totally agree with you, to be honest.
oh my God, get that on the record. Get that on the record. I know, that's what I'm saying. This is a,
I think our work is get that data. And spend our time there. All of what we're doing here, but I did read, see Ryan and I too. But we like having that information. And we don't spend time discussing it. We just have that information. We didn't have it.
it, okay, and yes. My challenge to use a bit broader, I use this as a specific example. Okay. Just be conscious of this type of request information. Again, when you come in with fresh eyes, hopefully the board will give you permission for these questions. And have conversations around why is this necessary, okay? Because if you can balance that and strip away, even if it's something that you really hold dear, all right, in order to create more time to do other things more strategically, because right now you seem to know a lot of background on your hires. Well, what I heard today was you had a really good plan 5 years ago, and the board has not followed through on that. And so if I were going to take you to task, so to speak, I would say you're putting your time and effort in the wrong place. Now, you know I'm not, but in terms of illustrating what I'm trying to get at, in terms of rethinking where you spend your time, and also being conscious of, and maybe asking Jim, how much time does it take to put together this single page? You know, what about other parts of the year where you might have several hires or so forth and so on? But that was just a good illustration of an example of maybe too much information for the board. Maybe I'll agree to each in the middle and say maybe, although I'm firmly on my side. But anyway, maybe. Go ahead, Jim.
Well, to go one step deeper as far as just the communication piece. I look at this and I start to just wonder what has taken place. Or was there a time where there was a lack of trust and process that was open, where the board started to say, in order to force openness, if you come to the superintendent and say, we want more details about what the hiring is, and I would say there's opportunity that the needs route present, here's what I envision as far as hiring committees. So I can have this conversation today. Contract stuff that we went through. And this came up as far as what is like that higher community look like for representation. So the question is, or the collective bargaining agreement is how much representation is enough, how much representation is too much shift that you advise. What does it look like to have, if you're having a math teacher, you have another math teacher on there, and the question is why, is the why, so that we can actually get good information and feedback regarding math-related questions. And are we actually asking math-related questions, or is it just to see if they fit? And that's what we start to deal with. And equities around bias. But that's, I think, what does the word mean with this advice? Want more openness or a sense of what your hiring practices look like. As hiring practice for me, I would envision that you should build into possible period in most schools that we actually develop a applicant review team and then a review team. We go through bias training and you've got to be your team for hiring for that particular review.
If I can use this to illustrate, this is where the conversation, or what's your policy on this? If I was hooked up, I'd show you, we can take this time, but what I would encourage you to do is, what is your policy that guides his work? Okay, be familiar with that first. Then, like Jim said, rather than perhaps each individual hire having an understanding of what my hiring practices are, that would be great information to share with the board. In terms of, and especially coming on as a newspaper, I say that what you just said is the text. All right. So now you know what the process is. Now, if you ever have some reason to believe that the process is not being followed, that's the phone call for the working with you that says, hey, coming about X, Y, and Z. I understand your process is this, did we follow it? But understanding what the procedures are at an administrative level, absolutely board work. So good example of a conversation I think to be had in terms of what's your role as a board. Again, my intent is stepping on that landmine. It's not so much to blow up that one situation.
So it's interesting, I think the reason we came up with this. Now be a very good one. But there was a certain amount of distrust on the board of how the hiring is being done.
Yep.
And rather than addressing it privately, we said, okay, these are our expectations, we want these things covered.
Yep. Perfect. Good response. Good question. Because many times that can be rooted back into something else back here. Do we still need it? And you may not, but it's a conversation worth having. All right, I'm gonna press this on because it's 8. So I want to stop here, take inventory. We were kind of looking at this operating agreement. We were going through the communication agreements. Do we want to continue more conversation around this? Because I was sensing the folks that are here kind of leaning towards this model. Now we've got a couple that are absent. You're going to want to bring them into the fold. So I know you're not going to approve anything tonight per se, but am I reading the room correctly in that this is going to fit our needs? It's got a bit more detail, but it's still a work in progress.
Well, I mean, I agree with Rusty in that, the one that you provided is just like, all of it is, yeah, we're gonna do this, but I also think about what Jim said in terms of, yeah, that's how our board sees it right now. You're looking at, potentially 3 new board members next school year. And it may not be the case, and so having something like this, that's a living document that gets reviewed on a regular basis is gonna be really important moving forward, especially just considering the dynamics of the school boards the last couple of years versus just 3 years ago, just when I took over, and like totally different environment.
Absolutely. This is how you, to some degree, describe your culture, your board culture. And if it's not here, I would say bring some statements forward to add to it. What you said, which I didn't see here, but so you must have been pulling it from someplace else.
Yeah, I got it. It's not.
Okay. In terms of the board honoring decisions that they make. In terms of, it's been voted on, it's been passed, the expectation is that we support this decision. That's a big. That's a big. I thought I might find it in your standards of conduct that I had up there earlier. I don't believe that was there. I've seen it in other places. But capture those types of things, because Stephen, you are spot on. Because you don't know every 2 years what the complexity of the board is and or as superintendents turnover, right? Yes, some of these things, many of these things you can find in policy. Sometimes I get pushback from boards that say, well, this is all in policy. Yeah, you got a policy manual of about 150 pages. How much of that do you know? Can we narrow this down to a page and hit the big items? Right. This does talk about questions ahead of time. It talks about number 4, in order to avoid surprises, we'll do these things. So I think it's a good starting point from what I heard you say.
Is any of this whining? I guess I hadn't thought about. this.
Okay, great question.
Come on,
Great question.
so
Did-
somebody misbehaving, so what?
Okay, yes, I need to finish that thought. Thank you, Rusty, very much. Yes, when you get to a document, even though it's a work in progress, it should be voted on by the board. And as long as the majority of the board approves it, it has the same impact as policy. Now, that said, what happens when a board member breaks policy? What can you do? Can you kick them out of their seat? No. There's actually only one way per policy and by law that the board can kick out another board member. It's around absences. A board member misses 4 consecutive board meetings in 4 months worth of duties. The board can remove them from their position. It's the strangest thing in the world, because I had to deal with this in South Huntington, because I had a board member that didn't show up as much as she should. So it has the same level or impact as policy when it's voted on by the board. Now, you can't remove the person, but here are the steps that I would recommend. I started to go down this path.
Shut up.
You can shut us to some degree, yes.
Publicly shaking.
Yeah, well, yes, okay, here's how it goes. So you've got this operating agreement, all right? Now, obviously, you can hold the superintendent accountable to the evaluation process if any of these things were to, cross those lines. But let's say board member to board member. So you go to your board chair. I consider Rusty's doing this, he's violating, this. It's your responsibility to talk to him. And that's board chair responsibility. So John sits down, has a conversation with Rusty, has some understanding. This is our operating agreement, however that conversation goes. Let's say it doesn't change the behavior. But what's step 2? Comes to the board as a whole. In a public meeting. I had to do this with one of my board members. Again, not me, who's my board chair. My former board chair at the time was the first year board chair. Great man, really good. But we were having this issue with the board members around her attendance. Anyway, we had to bring it to, because he had 2 conversations, one-on-one. Then you bring it to the board as a whole. This is our operating agreement. We believe you're not, you are violating this part of the operating agreement. Please stop that kind of thing. But it's a conversation at a board level. That's stage 2. Stage 3, and this is where you get advice from attorney, is you can have a public vote, basically, of no confidence, what we call censure. And so the board, and lawyers will probably advise you to do that if there's any liability that this particular board member might be exposing the board of the district to by violating this agreement. Is it something of a paper tiger? Yes. But those are the remedies that you have. Something great. Okay. So we talked about communication protocols. We're going to talk about board operating agreements. I'm trying to bring us to a close, but I'll be here as long as you want me to be. And you have questions. Jim, you seem poised to ask a question.
Right here, I would just maybe recommend that we take the draft here that's a little more comprehensive. Bring it back at a later date to another work session, and just go through it. In fact, I'm looking at like number 5, communication agreements. Oh, there's a couple here. Superintendent will communicate directly with the board, and then the board member request information shall be disseminated to all members of the board. I think that's the discussion as well. What was that? When a serious incident involving staff, students, parents, and community member occurs. I think there's been there, I could say like personnel issues, especially personnel issues that people doing that. I'll communicate directly with John and say we should put that online as far as the board with this kind of. But there's, I think there's.
Hang on, Jim. Okay. If you communicate to the board chair. Well, I mean, how do I want to phrase this? You're absolutely right about there are certain information about personnel that you can't share with the board, including the board chair. The reason I'm even bringing this up is because I've worked with a couple of other boards where the superintendent board relationship is different from the rest of the board at cost division. Because the board chair was getting information the rest of the board wasn't. And you don't want that dynamic to creep up. What the board has to understand is around personnel, there's certain things that just you should not be told. And then I would draw the line there. I think your point about looking at number, well, it's 5, third bullet or fourth bullet, having an understanding there that there's certain personnel pieces that cannot be shared. Many years ago, I worked on the board, the superintendent had left. They had a standing executive session every month where the superintendent would come in and basically share things with the board around personnel issues. This person's on a plan of assistance, this person is, discipline this, X, Y, Z. All
Out of executive session?
in executive session,
Oh, okay,
which was still illegal.
well, yeah, but I just.
Yeah, no, it was done in executive. No, it was done in executive session, all right? But the executive session wasn't used properly. It was just used as kind of a catch-all for the superintendent. So just because something's told you in executive session doesn't necessarily make it right. But I use it to illustrate that there is a pretty bright line when it comes to personnel. What I think that particular bullet is trying to get at is serious incidents in terms of maybe health, or we had this incident in school, or those types of things. But I think what Jim's trying to get at in terms of personnel issues and dealing with personnel.
Well, I can think of 2 examples recently where you reported on the lawsuit, potential lawsuit. That seemed appropriate. Right? Where you wouldn't have reported it. And
Public session or executive session?
no, it wasn't me.
Right.
And that seems to qualify here where it is a serious incident, and it seems to be the others would be, we never have to be able to get it. COVID related stuff was meaningful. When there was an outbreak or something along those lines, something serious had happened. Students with. It does seem to me that it doesn't necessarily mean, see, it says staff, that it's not personnel matters per se. It's not what they said.
No, and I think that's the purpose I was trying to make, is to come back and go through.
Right, yeah.
Clear understanding of the differences, so that we didn't walk away and then a month from now say, well, Jim, we agreed that serious incidents. And for somebody else, a serious incident might have meant these other things.
Good point. What do we mean by? What are the parameters around it? You're absolutely right.
Also, I think for our board in our situation, it's back for this, for the board chair and the vice chair and the superintendent and the agenda. I've been a position of chair and vice chair several times. And it always goes more than budget or in office superintendent. We had various superintendents who lose that time. Probably inappropriately, to use those 2 people, the sounding board. And those 2 people being able to deal with really what's going on, and the other 3 members don't know what's going on. And it's never been a horrible situation, but it's been a situation for people. run out of things, to the board. And we would think we all don't be equal, but it's really we're equal. So, I think being really aware of that, and we just want to appreciate it, Jim. That happened to the whole board, we all know, we all have the same information. They're very often over the past many years, we have no that happens by conference. We should like great world and all of that. Being over courteous. Sometimes pay attention to the achievement. But they push it that direction.
You do a better job than you think you do. I'm not trying to chastise you that way.
We do.
I know you do. I know you do.
That, if there's a problem.
And well, look, thanks for bringing me back to that point. I just don't want to see that dynamic where the superintendent board or the chair relationship is so different that it would alienate other members of the board, and I see that. And again, sometimes superintendents will overshare with the board chair and or vice chair. And you just don't want to start down that path. So Jim, sorry, I interrupted you, but you were going through saying, hey, bring this back, let's maybe work through this, talk specifically about some of these bullets. Sounds like you've got some language that perhaps you want to include. You mentioned something from the ESD.
Well, not necessarily to include, I think I was just trying to make the point of having a more comprehensive, reasons for having a more comprehensive. Again, I think what we're talking about this as well is. Should have been inside, walk out there and say. And how do we? One of the things I think I asked the board when I was taking this was, what are you looking for from the current superintendent, which was still, these are one of the ways that we provide stability.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so it sounds like you've got a next step. Concrete one. What else can I do or should we do in terms of wrapping things up tonight? And have we hit the major points that I was given to hit tonight?
Super helpful.
You have my phone number. You should have my email address. As questions arise, please feel free. What I'd like for you to do. I'll give myself a copy. Oh, here it is. The very first thing that I handed out to you, we kind of touched on it. I think I hit the guts of it. It's the board's role in raising student achievement. This is what Wilda described that we started 4 or 5 years ago, that you've got some frameworks from, that you're probably still doing pieces of it. I'm almost sure came out of that conversation. What was there, and it was repurposed for that. Pay attention to this thing that you read through it, call me, ask me questions. I strongly encourage you, again, as you get a little deeper into the school year and Jim gets settled in, but let's come back and visit this. Let's talk about how I or everyone on my team can help you continue this conversation. You've got lots of really good pieces laying around. All right. We'd love the opportunity to help you strengthen that and take it even further. So that's the other piece that I would encourage you to kind of look at as a board. And again, you've got my contact information. It's great to come down here and be with you tonight. I'm sorry, Drew and John couldn't join us, but you know, life happens, and I appreciate everybody else that was here. If there's no more questions for me, Stephen, I guess I'll kick it back to you to finish this up.
All right, sounds good. I just want to make sure that the board, we weigh in on Jim's suggestion about this operating agreement, how we specifically how we move forward with it. Jim, you were asking if we put it back into the next packet for all of us to review and to be able to be ready to discuss the next work session.
Yeah, I would say we take, some of the rules of education. It's really slow. We've got a normal, work, our regular sessions that meet, with back in the work session, next time we go through. The regular session that haven't gone through here as well.
Right, yeah, I agree that that's important. So would that be something that goes on the packet? Is it something that we send out just as an email, like, here's this, we discussed this, the most recent work session. Please look this over and be prepared to discuss it at the next work session, which is on this date.
Well, what I suggest is we include this in the January 9th. Regular meeting agenda under discussion, put this in there so we can have a chance to read it. And then the highlights of the discussion is, further intent is sort of what we're talking about, sort of bring it back to the work session. That would be the last questions, or even highlight the discussions of what folks here. Which I think we can see at the work session.
Okay.
That's good.
Well done. No, it's okay.
Think about it.
I didn't want to just speak.
I guess I was thinking was, what I was thinking about, which is why I was, hoping it's part of what you were saying was, our meetings today have been very short.
Mhm.
It's been very pleasant to start the end here at home. But I think there's a lot of work that we could be doing with that. Other than that. Yeah.
Right, so 8:21, I guess we're later. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Steve.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
And Kimberly, I'm saying